you to a wonderful meeting that we have scheduled for everyone. Very timely for those of us who have been working in doing any kind of HR function this year, which I imagine most of the attendees have. So we have a very experienced group from Wilson Turner Kosmo, very friends of the ACC. So on behalf of the board of ACC, I'd like to welcome them both. We have Michael Kalt, a partner in their employment law practice group of Wilson Turner, who has worked there since 1996. He's got a practice that emphasizes litigation and trial. And he also provides advice and training to employers on employee discipline, investigation, and is currently the governmental affairs director for the California State Council for the Society for Human Resources Management, which I know a lot of us look to for guidance on these kinds of issues. And we have Mr. Lonny Zilberman, also a partner in Wilson Turner's employment law practice group, who also works with employers to try and find practical solutions to their issues. Mr. Zilberman is also in the ADR field as a mediator, which is wonderful. For those of us who have had these kinds of issues, we know how important mediation can be in these kinds of events come up. So we have a very robust presentation today, and Wilson Turner would love to make it as interactive as possible with participation from you. So to the extent that you want to speak up and unmute yourself and ask a question, that you are highly encouraged to do so. We can obviously use the chat function, but if you just want to go ahead and ask the questions directly, that is great. And we want to do that because we're sure that if you're thinking about a question, I'm sure somebody else in the group is too. So they will be going over some PowerPoints and in a share screen mode. So with no further ado, I think I will turn it over to these gentlemen and we'll get started.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Michael and I are really happy to be with you guys virtually. As Michael said earlier, I don't know if some of you were not on yet, but there's a lot of very familiar names in the boxes. Normally we do this in our conference room and we have some light refreshments, some adult beverages. It's in the afternoon. So this time we're doing it at noon and it's virtual, but we're gonna hopefully try to give you the same bang for the buck. There's a lot to talk about, and obviously it is definitely a new year and a new world. I'm gonna share my screen with you, and hopefully this will work. There we go. And what Michael and I thought we would do is, by the way, I know Audrey has sent out already the firm puts together an annual checklist, if you will, of all those things that employers need to think about and do for the new year. And I know that that's been distributed. If for some reason you didn't get it, feel free to either let me or Michael know, and we're happy to give it to you. It's a 16-page document this year, and it's primarily based on all of the new legislation. So the program today is going to be, we're going to cover some of that, touch on the high level, big ticket items, but really it's more about what we are expecting both at the state level and at the federal level in the new administration, and some of the things that we could see very, very soon. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michael for a quick review of last year.
Thanks, Lonnie. Yeah, the word for 2020 was wow. No one saw that coming, did they? A lot of familiar faces on the screen here. And I remember when we met back in January of last year, I don't think anyone had mentioned the word pandemic or COVID. I think the focus was on AB5, independent contractor standard stuff, and then the whole world turned upside down in March of last year, to the point where even the legislature suspended its session and then truncated the number of bills that were going to be discussed throughout the year. I guess there were some positives about that, in the sense that 2020 saw fewer new laws in California than had been enacted in almost a 20-year period. And we even saw fewer new employment laws than we normally see. So that was a slight positive. And then of the laws that were enacted, there was definitely, and not surprisingly, a COVID-19 related focus. most of the big bills had COVID-19 in their sights, and then a number of them took effect on an urgency basis throughout the years they were enacted. So many of them were enacted as they went along, meaning employers had additional time to get ready for them. Overall, there were about 25 new laws that were enacted. As Lonny mentioned, we're not going to go through all those. We suspect you sat through a couple of those programs up to this point, but we wanted to cover a couple things. And then if you wanted to look at any of the other laws, you can look at the materials that we had sent out. Perhaps nothing defines 2020 more than the first law we'll talk about, which is AB 1867, which is a law that took effect in September and seems to have already gone away. And that deals with COVID supplemental paid sick leave. So the big picture on AB 1867 was it was intended to fill in the gaps where the FFCRA at the federal level had left off. So whereas the FFCRA applied to employers with 500 or fewer employees, AB 1867 applied to employers with 500 or more employees, and it required them to provide up to 80 hours of COVID supplemental paid sick leave under certain circumstances related to COVID-19. It was supplemental leave, meaning it applied on top of the paid sick leave that you needed to apply or provide under the mandatory paid sick leave, and it took effect last September. Now, the interesting thing about that bill was it was tied to the FFCRA, and the FFCRA, the leave portions of the FFCRA were not extended past December 31st. The tax credits were extended. So if you continue to voluntarily provide FFCR-related leave in 2021 up through March 15th, you can still take the tax credit, but the leave itself was not extended. So AB 1867, at least the leave portion of it, appears to have expired. Now, a couple quick takeaways, because nothing is ever necessarily final in California. One, if under AB 1867, if someone was taking leave before December 31st and they had still time left in their bank, they can complete that in 2021, even though the law itself has expired. Secondly, as we often see in California, you're going to need to look to the the city level, because there's about a half dozen supplemental paid sick leave ordinances, Sacramento, LA, San Francisco, et cetera, and a number of them have already extended into 2021. So you're going to want to keep looking at that. And then you need to look at other leave laws that might apply, including the potential for exclusion pay under the Cal-OSHA temporary emergency standard, which came out just a couple weeks ago. And then as part of our theme, you also need to look ahead. Very likely in either DC or Sacramento, we're going to see some version of the FFCRA or AB 1867 extended. And then the question will be, does it apply on a retroactive basis? So stay tuned on AB 1867, even though it's technically already expired. The next one is AB 685, which deals with COVID-19 notices. Essentially, this does a couple things for employers. It requires employers to provide written notices to various people, mainly employees, exclusive representatives, and people who might have been exposed under very short time frames, essentially one business day, if there is a potential exposure at the workplace. And so you would need to be prepared to provide that notice, letting them know about the potential exposure, the leave benefits they're entitled to, their legal protections, and how you're going to remedy the COVID-19 related exposure in the workplace and the safety plan. So you have to do that within 24 hours. Secondly, if you meet the state definition of an outbreak, you have to provide notice to a public agency within 48 hours. That's a whole separate notice. So the couple things you need to do there is, one, develop, if you haven't already done so, because this law took effect January 1st, and obtain either a template COVID-19 potential exposure notice. And then you're going to want to make sure you have an updated contact list for your employees so you can get that notice out within the 1-day period. And then because there's a 3-year retention period for those notices, you're going to want to go ahead and make sure you have updated your document retention guidelines. Third bill we wanted to touch base on was SB 1383, which is not a COVID-related bill, but it is a big one. It deals with the expansion of the CFRA. And expands CFRA in two major respects. One, it dropped the eligibility requirement from the previous requirement of having 50 employees, which was synonymous with federal law. It dropped it down to 5 employees, meaning almost every employer is going to be covered by CFRA. And secondly, even for those employers that were already covered by CFRA, it changed the definition of family members for whom medical leave could be taken. So it adds grandparents, grandchildren, siblings, and domestic partners, and it changes the definition of child. It also eliminated the same employer and the key employee limitations on the amount of leave. So things to do: if you're a larger employer, update your CFRA leave policies. And then if you're a smaller employer, you're going to want to implement your CFRA leave policy and familiarize yourself with the CFRA leave administration. Next on our agenda was SB 973, which is equal pay reports. And this is kind of an outgrowth of the federal law. And Lonny will be talking about that as well. But long story short, this is California enacting a law that the Trump administration had rolled back under the from the Obama administration. And what this requires is larger employers that have 100 or more employees have to submit an EEO-1 report. They have to submit to the DFEH on an annual basis a report identifying race, ethnicity, and sex within various pay bands and job categories, and identifying the amounts of earnings that are paid to those employees. Another quick bill that we'll talk about, maybe affecting a lot of the people in this room, is AB 979, which is a trend to watch, and that deals with board of director diversity requirements. Taking a quick step back, in 2018, California was the first state that required California corporations to have a female board member. In 2020, California also now requires that employers have one board member from an underrepresented community, as is defined in the statute. So by the end of 2021, you're going to have at least one female board member and one member from a underrepresented community. And then the number of board members will increase in future years depending upon the size of your board. Another thing that was a big item was AB 2257 that dealt with independent contractor classification. AB 5 has been a huge issue for the last couple years, and the standard, the ABC test that we're going to use, very simply summarized for present purposes, because that bill was it was like 25 pages worth of text. What it essentially did was it created a whole new host of industry-specific carve-outs that said that you will apply the Borrello test rather than the ABC test, and it reconfigured slightly the business-to-business and referral agency statutes. AB 5 was going to be the big subject in 2020. It was discussed, but it'll be back in 2021, especially in light of Prop 22, which passed for the gig workers, and in light of what's going on at the federal level. And then lastly, before we start taking a look ahead, in November, we had Cal OSHA wade into the COVID-19 standards, and it developed its emergency temporary standards. And these took effect on November 30th. So I'm sure a lot of you have been dealing with them up to this point. They're constantly being updated. In fact, just this last Friday, they issued updated FAQs. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those, you might want to take a look at the DIR website, because they have some helpful FAQs as of this last week. Very broadly speaking, what this emergency standard requires is employers to develop a written COVID-19 prevention program to be able to identify and eliminate COVID-19 hazards, provide COVID-19 related training for employees, provide exclusion pay for employees that are unable to work because of a workplace exposure, but who otherwise would be able to work because they're physically able to do so, and provide various reports to public agencies. So that's that one in a nutshell, but is very, very detailed. Fortunately, the Cal OSHA website has some really good resources on that. So I've been checking it on a near daily basis, and I would commend almost everyone to do the same. Lonny, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide real quick.
Okay.
Beginning to look ahead for 2021. So our legislative session has already started, and it looks like it's going to be both in another unusual year, but it looks like it'll have a slightly more usual pattern. So by that, we're at the very beginning, and legislature is in normal session, and they have until the end of February for bills to be introduced. So far, the bills that have been introduced suggest that COVID is going to continue to be a huge focus, including potentially AB 1867 being extended. We're definitely going to have AB 5 related challenges, modifications, and revisions. There's been several bills introduced on that. And there's a bill that would require paid bereavement leave up to potentially 10 days, depending on the size of the employer. Kind of looking ahead, what do we think big picture? It's going to be an interesting year. One thing you want to look at is how things go with the federal government this year. I predict that it's going to be a slightly less antagonistic. It seemed like for the last couple of years, anything the federal government did, our government in Sacramento was saying they would do something different. We'll probably see less of that, although we're going to want to look to the federal government because the Biden administration is going to have some interesting things coming down the pike. And it'll be interesting to watch the federal government to see what of our bills the Biden administration decides to enact, such as AB 5 and our paid data reporting. A couple other quick things to keep an eye on. One, there are rumors that there will be slightly fewer bills this year, again, that they are curtailing the number of bills that could be considered. So that may be one positive. The Democrats have a slightly expanded veto-proof majority, which means it's easier for them to get things passed if they want to. But Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson has retired, and she was the second most powerful legislator on employment-related bills. Many of the bills we talk about every year, including this year's CFR expansion and pay data reporting, that was her. So with her gone, it may slow things down slightly. And then we've got Governor Newsom, who is potentially facing a recall and a battered economy. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that plays out in terms of what is the focus in 2021. With that, let's go ahead and turn it over to Lonny. We'll start looking ahead to what we can expect in the Biden administration.
Okay. Well, the first thing I got to say is things are changing at warp speed. And, Michael and I put this program, these PowerPoint slides together last Friday. And literally since last Friday, there's even more information than that we would have put on here had we known about it. So for example, the Biden administration has announced the nomination of Boston Mayor Marty Walsh as the next potential Secretary of Labor. So that is obviously going to have a big impact on everything you see on this slide. I didn't know, frankly, candidly, who Marty Walsh was, so I had to do some reading over the weekend. And turns out he is going to be the first union member to serve in the role of Secretary of Labor in over 50 years. And I mean, probably the best way for me to summarize it for you all in terms of, well, what is going to be the difference? So the current Department of Labor Secretary, as many of you know, is Eugene Scalia. That would be Justice Scalia's eldest son, who for 30 years was a management side partner at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. So we've got Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher management partner, now union president. So former union president. The two things that are number one on Marty Walsh's agenda, and again, this is just, by the sheer ability to Google this stuff that I did over the weekend, but two of his number one priorities are $15 minimum wage, federal minimum wage raise. That's going to be pretty challenging to do, but as we all know, that's already pretty much baked. I mean, that's what's happening in California. We're going to get to $15 an hour next year. And then the second priority that he identified was coming out with a legislative package which includes a paid family and medical leave act. So again, that's going to be something that obviously has been on the on the front burner in California already, but those are two priorities that we think are going to be big, among others. So what you're going to see, we believe, is a real pivot, and the pivot is from anti-union to pro-union, and that's the reality. That's the practical reality. So a lot of the things that were priorities, for example, for the Obama administration, which maybe didn't get over the line, we're going to see reintroduced. We're going to just tick off some things: the card check rather than the secret ballot election, the quickie election. I already talked about the minimum wage increase. Ban the box. Again, that's already the law in California. And as you all know, that's the box that talks about whether you've been convicted of a crime. They want to take that nationally and make that a national standard. Challenges, this is a big one. I mean, every year there's at least 3, if not half a dozen cases that sometimes move all the way up to the US Supreme Court on the enforceability of pre-employment arbitration agreements. In terms of class action waivers, in terms of arbitration in general, I think we're going to see a big push on perhaps limiting those types of agreements. Predictive scheduling, again, that's something that has been introduced in California, hasn't ever really gotten the full traction, but the incoming vice president, Senator Harris, she's a big proponent of that. So we may see something like that on a national level. Again, that's going to primarily affect like big box stores, very large retail employers. Again, more limits on confidentiality, more limits on non-disparagement, more limits on what we would call secret settlements. There's been some movement on that already, some legislation on that already, as you know, especially as it relates to sexual harassment allegations and claims, but look for more of that. And then, of course, limiting non-compete agreements. We don't have to, I mean, we know what that's like, because California is a total outlier. We already have, Business and Professions Code 16600, but looking at that from a national level is what we are predicting. So here's 5 things that we believe literally on, January 21, President Biden, once he's inaugurated, could sign executive orders on. The first one is the U-turn on joint employer liability. As many of you know, and I know it's a big hot button issue, the NLRB published their final rule in April of last year. Basically, it was a very pro-employer rule. It said that in order to get joint employer liability, you had to have, quote, substantial, direct, immediate control over another company's employees. That, basically was a about face to the previous Obama administration position. So that's something that, President Biden could probably reverse in an executive order. Another one is by the way, this is one of those items where on Friday we had said, oh yeah, you can send the sensitivity training band to the scrap heap. Guess what? It happened yesterday. So yesterday I saw a story in the Wall Street Journal that apparently the Department of Labor, as of yesterday, suspended enforcement of that executive order because it was blocked by a federal judge last Friday. Michael and I didn't see that when we were putting this together. So again, that one, maybe already checked the box on that. It sounds like that's already been suspended, but again, something that's pretty easy for President Biden to reverse. Resuscitating Obama era fair pay and safe workplace orders. Again, these are things that the Trump administration reversed. It was one of those things where if you're bidding on a federal contract and you've been cited for violations, you had to put those on your website. So that is something that is probably going to be reversed. Reviving the right of first refusal. So again, these are government contracts. If this was overturned by Trump in 2019, if a federal contractor takes over a contract from another federal contractor, it used to be that they had to give the right of first refusal to all the employees that were already working on that contract. That was overturned, so now that could be reversed as well. Again, doesn't apply to everyone, applies to federal contractors, but nonetheless, it could be a pretty significant change. And then finally, and this was something that really didn't get a lot of publicity, but kind of in the dead of night, in early November of last year, President Trump signed Executive Order 13957, making it a lot easier to essentially fire career civil servants from policy-making positions. I guess thinking was, or the rationale was, that it provided a greater degree of appointment flexibility. It's safe to say that that really shook a lot of career civil servants, because all of a sudden now their tenure and their job security was at risk. Safe to say that will also be overturned. I'm going to move it back over to Michael, who's going to talk about some additional agenda items for the incoming Biden administration.
Yeah, in this portion of thing, we're going to focus on the agency things, but I want to go back to the legislative thing for just a second, because I think it highlights just what a fun time of year this is and what a challenge and an opportunity this program has been. If you'd asked Lonny and I 8 days ago, so January 4th, what were the prospects of getting most of that legislation through? Most people, including Lonny and I, would probably have said, well, they're not going to have 50, the Democrats won't have 50 Senate seats, so they're not going to be able to get a whole lot of it through. And then Georgia happened. And so the shifting has now focused from will there be 50 Democrats in the Senate to will the filibuster remain, and how many things will Joe Manchin be voting along with the Democrats on? So all of a sudden, a lot of things we thought would not happen likely will happen. And then going back to sort of a big picture theme there for a second, Lonny had titled that last slide Back to the Future. And I think that's a great way to look at it, because perhaps the best predictor of what President Biden is likely to do is to look back at what he did as vice president. And then in that regard, you always see this seesaw effect. And so the Trump administration made it a mission, it seemed, to roll back everything the Obama administration had done. And so a lot of what you're going to see is the Biden administration bringing us back to where the Obama administration was. And that includes on the agency related things, where I want to focus for a couple minutes, because that's still likely to be a big area. First thing I want to talk about, the sort of gig economy and the independent contractor issues. This may not have too much of an effect in California, but it's going to be a huge issue nationally. And there's probably going to be both some defensive and some offensive steps taken by the Biden administration. The first one on the defensive side of things. So just last week, the DOL published a final rule regarding independent contractors under the FLSA. And picking up on what Lonny said, that rule was arguably very employer driven. It was very employer friendly. And it focused on the economic realities and economic dependence for the independent contractor relationship. The problem is, even though it was put out in a final rule last week, it doesn't take effect until March 8th. And the Biden administration has already signaled that they intend to issue an executive order freezing any final regulations that have not taken effect yet. So even if that doesn't hold water, they will do so, and then you'll have to have some litigation as to what that means. Now that there are 50 senators on the Democratic side of things, you may also see them try to challenge through the Congressional Review Act, which is a way to basically invalidate agency determinations or executive orders. So we may see that as well. So the independent contractor rule, which came out from the DOL, was a very interesting read, all 261 pages of it, but I don't think it's going to take effect. The second thing you'll see on the independent contractor piece, though, is offensive. And that is during the campaign, the Biden administration, both the president and the vice president, signaled a support for the ABC test out in California. And so they may very well attempt to take nationwide the ABC test in California. So keep a watch out for that. Even if they don't go that far, there's definitely going to be some type of regulation there. On the minimum wage, Lonny touched on that. The effort to go to 15, I don't know if that will happen nationwide, but we're definitely going to see a minimum wage increase, and then it'll be interesting to see how California responds. The more interesting thing may be whether or not the Biden administration attempts to revisit the Obama era standard, where they had attempted to establish a much higher salary threshold for exempt employee purposes. I think they were targeting something in the $57,000 or $51,000 range, and the Trump administration enacted something sort of splitting the difference between the two. And the other piece of that was there were big changes to the duties portion of things as well. So it'll be interesting to see if the incoming Biden administration attempts to do that. The NLRB, that's where, as Lonny mentioned, it's going to be a huge focus for the incoming administration. President Biden has already signaled he intends to be a union president. and historically, the party that's in control gets to have a majority on the board. It may take some time for that to take effect as terms wrap up, but with Senate control now in the Democratic hands, that's eventually going to go to 3-2. And then you will see a complete rollback of many of the things that the Trump administration had rolled back on the Obama administration, including such things as neutrality requirements, union access to employee emails, persuader regulations, micro-unit bargaining, quickie elections, just a whole host of things. And even if that takes some time to achieve, almost immediately they're going to be able to appoint a new general counsel for the NLRB, who then sets out the enforcement guidelines and strategies. And so you're going to see a big change right away. Another one is OSHA. And I touched on the Cal OSHA changes back in November. One thing incoming President Biden harped on repeatedly was that he thought the federal OSHA was not moving quickly enough on COVID-19 related developments. So you can almost bet, even if it's not day one, that very soon into the Biden administration, you will see some federal COVID-19 related regulations, and they may look very similar to what we saw on the California side of things. Lonny, let's go to the next slide. Two other agencies we'll touch on real quickly, and then we'll turn it back over to Lonny. The EEOC, it's another agency that is currently 3-2, but the incoming administration is eventually going to fill the positions as people drop off or their terms expire. So at some point, likely in 2021 or 2022, it will be 3-2 again in favor of the Democrats. And so they're almost certainly going to restore the pay data reporting requirements that the Trump administration had suspended and that California has now enacted under SB 973. Probably won't affect us too much, but again, a lot of people are suddenly going to find themselves dealing with what California is now dealing with this year. And then, of course, the EEOC under new board will be able to set out its focus areas, which are going to look very different than what the Trump administration was. So it'll probably go back to the Obama administration in terms of focusing on things such as systemic discrimination. Pay equity for sure is going to be a huge focus, and then sexual orientation, and then gender identity. And then, of course, the DOL, that's another one, as Lonny mentioned, the incoming person, very union friendly, complete change from what Scalia was focused on. So some changes we're going to see there. The DOL under the Trump administration had brought back the opinion letters that employers could write in to go ahead and obtain. That's probably going to get suspended. Almost anything that the Trump administration, and they've been pumping out regulations over the last couple of weeks, almost anything that's coming out, whether it's regarding economic realities tests for independent contractors, joint employer standard, tip pooling, if they don't become effective by next week, they're almost certainly going to go ahead and get stayed. So that's your agency look. And now Lonny will go ahead and talk a little bit about what we expect to see from trends on the HR side of things and business side, because we're all dealing with a new world in this pandemic world.
Yeah, so my one takeaway is for us on this Zoom conference is full employment for all of us. It does not seem like it's going to be, not enough to do. There's going to be plenty of stuff to do, and it seems like things are changing at the speed of light. And we've just tried to cover again the main points from a legal perspective over the last 35 minutes or so. But there, as you all know, because Michael and I know, again, based on the names that are here, that you guys all have a distinctly, HR type focus, many of you. And so that's another piece that we think 2020 has been a bombshell, and it's just a complete rewrite. In fact, we threw away the playbook. There is no playbook anymore, right? And people are just kind of making stuff up as we go along. Before I get, so one of the things that we did, and one of the things I did was I went and really kind of surveyed the land and figured out, tried to come up with, what are some of the top 7. I remember going to a PowerPoint class one time and they always said pick an odd number, So I picked 7 things that will likely change in 2021 and that we've seen already change in 2020. But before I start talking about this, I just wanted to pause briefly and say, just based on anything and everything that Michael and I have been talking about already, anybody have any thoughts, questions, follow up? And I'll just stop talking for a few seconds and anyone can unmute and chime in. Okay, so I'm sure that we've answered all your questions. So let me briefly talk about some of the quote unquote non-legal things that we are seeing and that we have seen and that probably are going to continue into 2021. The first thing is that, again, historically, HR has always been seen as kind of an administrative function. It's always been seen as responding to something, there's a harassment complaint, someone gets injured, someone, doesn't feel like they're being paid correctly, all kinds of reactive type of functions. I think the one thing that 2020 has shown us, and we're going to see this going forward, is HR is becoming much more of a business partner to the extent that it wasn't already, much more of a value-driven logistics resource, much more proactive in coming up with the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that we didn't see before, and trying to also, again, and I'll just share with you all just from our own personal perspective, right? In terms of our firm, and this has been a blessing in a way, but we've been so inundated with new work that we've had to hire more people during the pandemic, our firm, than we've ever hired in the history of Wilson Turner Kosmo. And so that I'm just sharing that as a fact that here we are in a scenario where we've had to onboard and orient and bring into our firm culture a lot of new people. And it's been a challenge. And I wonder whether that's something that you all have had to deal with, or some of you had to deal with as well. Because that's something that is definitely going to be changing the way we bring new employees on. Let's face it, everyone is starting out virtually. And so, it is a different world. So that's first big change. Second big change, and kind of dovetailing with that, is where we do our work, right? It's just coincidental that Michael and I both came into the office today, so we're actually both in our offices, but that's not the norm, or it hasn't been for 2020, and it probably won't be for much of 2021. So this hybrid model of remote work, and all of the challenges that poses, and I know many of you have had those challenges and have had to deal with those issues. And again, from an HR perspective, just tons of questions, and we've been fielding tons of questions. And so that is something that is also in terms of, fashioning teams, trying to, collaborate, trying to figure out, just from a technological standpoint, how to get everyone on board, from a scheduling standpoint. One of the silver linings, though, is it actually seems like there is more potential for, believe it or not, interactivity, right? So for example, I'll just even point out this program today. Like right now, there are 27 of you on this program. Now, I didn't participate in every ACA program, every roundtable that our firm has done over the last 4 or 5 years. But, when we were doing these at 4 o'clock in our conference room, we were lucky to get 15 of you to drive down to San Diego, to take the time and do it. And now, because, all of you are remote, hey, everybody's got an extra hour to spare. Everybody can just log on to Zoom and participate. So it is a new model of work, and a model where I think in a way we can, while virtual, connect even more than we have been able to before. Okay. And that brings us to the next one, which is employee wellness. That's another area where, from a benefits standpoint and from a support standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, I think we're seeing a lot of changes. Again, there's really been no playbook for this, so we're kind of making this up as we go along. But that is something that I think we will see as a big change for 2021. Which again dovetails with HR becoming much more agile, pivoting, being able to adapt quickly to new challenges, trying to stay ahead of the curve, trying to adopt policies and procedures that we've never had to adopt before. Again, I think with every challenge, there's also an opportunity. I want to touch briefly on diversity. That's been, a huge buzzword in the last, couple of years for sure, if not longer. Inclusion, equity, training on microaggressions. We've all been doing it, right? And the question really is it working? Is it working? I would commend to all of you, one of the people that I like to read in the New York Times is a columnist by the name of David Brooks. Very thoughtful guy, not an HR, not a lawyer, not an HR expert, but he recently wrote a column, and you can Google it. I believe it was actually on the last day of last year. I think it was on December 31st. And it was a column about like what we've learned from 2020 and how to adapt it to 2021. And one of the focuses of this column was how, the truth is, if you look at the statistics, that unfortunately all of this diversity and inclusion training we've been doing, I'm not sure it's working. I mean, that's his theme. And his thesis is that we may need to rethink that and how it works, and whether it's really making real change, both, in the boardroom level and, kind of at the level of the rank and file, if you will. So I think that's going to be something in 2021 that I see as continually going to be evolving as we rethink various models for training and for how to really better deal with inclusion, racial sensitivity, belonging, equity. Michael pointed out some of the new laws that we're seeing, expanding the requirements of diversity in the boardroom, but how do we really filter that down to the rank and file? That's going to be an open question, and I think that's going to be a challenge for many of us, both in-house and at the outside counsel positions. Another way HR is changing is a shift from silos to open source. Again, collaboration is the word of the day. Doing all, whether it's Zoom or Teams or all these other different platforms that we're seeing, I think doing that kind of collaborative work is more important now than ever. And to that point, and the final point here is, kind of rethinking where the workplace is, right? And how that has a trickle or ripple effect on lots of other areas of law. So for example, as we were kind of brainstorming ideas of where things are changing, think about it from a ADA, accommodation perspective. I mean, that's an issue that we all deal with almost on a daily basis. It is front and center. And there used to be a time, right, not too long ago, where Michael and I would get calls from clients and we'd hear, Mary or Bob, or, fill in the blank, want an accommodation. And the accommodation is they want to work from home. They want to telecommute. And I mean, honestly, the thinking was, well, should we accommodate that? What are all the downsides? What are all the potential pitfalls? oh no, they can't do their job remotely. That's not possible. They need to interact. They don't have the technology. We're not going to get accountability. How do we know that they're going to actually do their job duties? That's out the window, right? I mean, can we really honestly, with a straight face make that argument that somehow telecommuting is not a reasonable accommodation anymore? For most jobs, I think 2020 has shown us that that's probably not going to be a very good defense. So that's one example of where, telecommuting, the whole kind of dynamic of where we work and how we work is really going to be affecting us in ways that we can't even imagine yet, right? And so I think that, it is left to be seen. I mean, we're all, hoping for the best and keeping our fingers crossed that hopefully the vaccine rollout will be, quick and will be, effective, and will enable us to hopefully, as quickly as we can, get back to what, quote unquote, normal is. But the reality is that we're still going to be, from everything I'm reading and I'm seeing, that number one, that rollout and the mass vaccinations really aren't going to happen until, or hopefully they're going to happen, by the summertime. And then on top of that, and again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not dispensing medical advice, but from what I'm reading, all the epidemiologists are saying that, you can still get COVID, even if a vaccine is 95% effective, you just won't get, severe symptoms. So again, that tells me that, are we still going to have social distancing? Probably. Are we still going to be wearing masks? Probably. Are we still going to be having huge gatherings? Unknown. And of course, as we've seen, even in the brief, 12 days that has been 2021, there's a lot of different things going on in different states, right? And so, what's happening in California is just in terms of vaccine distribution and inoculation is very different than what's happening in Florida, for example, and in other states. So, and it is, again, I cannot emphasize enough how it's like, if Michael and I were doing this program tomorrow, we may have, different statements that we would be making and different comments just based on what transpired in the last 24 hours. So stay tuned, but it's definitely going to be a whirlwind of change, and not the least of which is going to come at the HR level. And we just need to be ready for it. And a lot of it is going to be, addressing issues and dealing with problems that are new and different and that we have not seen before. Let's briefly talk about, and again, Michael and I welcome your input at any time. If anybody wants to unmute themselves or send a question via chat, if that's easier, I'm happy to do it that way as well. We're going to talk a little bit about our 2021 resolutions and likely trends. I'm going to throw it back to Michael real quick, and he's going to cover some of these points.
Yeah, so picking up on Lonnie's theme about how telecommuting, I think, was supposed to be 15 days to flatten the curve, and it became all of 2020, and now it's part of 2021. I think the reality is telecommuting and remote work is going to be permanent. Even if people come back to the office in some semblance, there's going to be a certain portion of the workforce that's going to continue to work remotely, either on a part-time or a full-time basis. So one of the big issues is certainly going to be, how do you deal with that reality? But then also, how do you apply what are arguably 19th or 20th century concepts in the employment code into a 21st century non-physical workplace reality? Because the reality is there are no presently California laws that govern telecommuting. So you're sort of guessing as to how these things should apply. And that's going to be a struggle moving forward. Good news on that front, though, is we know that the legislature in California is looking at that issue. And so hopefully we'll get some guidance there, which sort of gets to another theme, which is, it's not on here, but we're talking about resolutions. I guess in addition to losing the COVID-10 that everyone may have gained, would be to get more involved, because these new laws don't come out in a vacuum, and we're the ones who are dealing with this on a daily basis. And so maybe we're not first responders, but we may qualify as second responders, and therefore we may want to go ahead and provide input on these telecommuting and other related issues, so we don't have the usual forces driving them. Another big issue, obviously, is going to be the vaccine rollout. Lonny mentioned it about the timing and the challenges that are going to be there, but I think that employers need to think through. We're getting questions about how to address that reality. For instance, what is going to be the employer's policy about vaccinations? Are you going to require them? And if not, or if you're going to require them generally, under what circumstances won't you require them? Maybe also helpful to know, especially in a multi-generational workforce, what portions of your workforce is entitled to get the vaccine and when? And do you have a person who is tasked with sort of monitoring those issues, including with a government agency, to see, what resources are out there, or to ensure that your workers are getting vaccinated when they're eligible to do so? And then who's overseeing the return to work issues and figuring out all those issues that Lonny just identified, but how you're going to get your employees back into the workforce. One item that's not on here, but I think the events over the last couple of days have sort of driven it home, is again the issue of political speech and what the limits are going to be. This comes up from time to time. It's funny. We get those alerts saying, well, with the election coming up, employers need to figure out how they're going to monitor that in the workforce. And I'll be honest, that didn't appear to be too much of an issue for most of 2020, but perhaps that was because everybody was working remotely. And then last week we saw what happened in Washington, D.C., and I've already begun to see calls from employers asking, well, can I discipline employees who participated in that rally and or might have been over at the Capitol? Some interesting issues that are involved there. In terms of California limits on ability to discipline employees for engaging in political activities, but of course it has to be lawful activity. So does it change if it's an unlawful insurrection? And then is your policy being enforced consistently if you didn't enforce it the same way last year when we saw the various riots seeking social justice? So it's just interesting to see how quickly things can pop up on the radar. So I would throw political speech out here as a likely trend as well. And then again, I would just reiterate on the 2021 resolutions, and we would love to hear what's on your radar in terms of either trends that you're seeing or perhaps that one resolution you've identified for your workforce for the upcoming year. I would just say get involved, work with your local trade groups, or if you have a government affairs person in your office, or your elected representative, pick up the phone, schedule a meeting, and make sure you provide your input, because it really does matter.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I sent a little headline I saw today in the chat that said "Get vaxxed or get axed." That's another question, in terms of employers' ability to mandate vaccinations. I've seen stories in technology journals about how, vaccination for COVID is going to become like a new passport. We're all going to have apps on our phones. You want to fly, you got to show that you've been vaccinated. You want to enter this, arena, you got to show you've been vaccinated. I mean, again, this is all kind of still very much crystal ball, like if it's going to actually come to pass, but these are things that could be in the future. Michael and I have put together some additional resources for you on this slide. There's a lot of good websites that we regularly, go on to and check and see if there's any news or changes. So there's some additional resources. Again, my understanding is I think Audrey made our slides available, so you'll have those. And then of course the different agencies, they all have very good FAQs, very good like news updates that you can scan for information. And here's additional websites and resources that are kind of on our bookmarked list on our browsers. So we're getting close to 1 o'clock. We've got about another 7 minutes. Again, Michael and I are happy to, normally this is kind of a discussion, so we're happy to hear anybody's comment or question, reaction to anything we've said. Feel free.
And then before anyone jumps into the question, I would echo Lonnie's comment there about checking the websites. It is a ritual that I do almost every morning. I come in, I check the California legislative website to see what new bills have been introduced, and that's a lengthy list. But then I have a set of various agency websites that I check because they don't always just blast it out to the public. You almost have to go on, and it's like a Where's Waldo type search. And then see like, oh, Cal OSHA just issued this last Friday, updated FAQs regarding the temporary emergency standard. That'd be helpful information to have seen. Or the DOL has suddenly published guidance on what it means for the FFCRA expiring. So if you're getting those updates regularly, great. But if you're not, with how quickly things change, I would commend you to have a host of those websites and just check them out periodically. Or have your outside counsel on speed dial, because those things are changing pretty quickly.
I have a question. It seems that I can find, federal changes, OSHA changes, California state changes, but I find it incredibly difficult to find cities, the city ordinances. There doesn't seem to be a cohesive city ordinance where I can go, or a website, or resources where I can go and keep track of the Bay Area PACE laws, for San Jose and San Francisco, what's going on with LA. I know when all of the eviction laws were coming out at the city ordinance level for a company like mine, it was incredibly difficult to track because there seemed to be no central repository of that. I'm just curious if you have any advice for those of us who are trying to track those city ordinances about the easiest way to do so.
Unfortunately, no, although I think you may have just stumbled onto a great idea for an app. And so maybe we can come up with something. It is very frustrating trying to do it at the municipal level, including since within the various different cities, they have different boards. So there's not always the same methodology in terms of where you're even looking for these things. So yeah, it is very frustrating. Yeah, what I often have to do if I know that there's something out there, I will just turn to the Google. And then hopefully that'll take me into something that will get me to a link. There are certain agencies that I do look at, like the San Francisco Office of Labor Standards Enforcement. That's a good one. But in terms of like a single set website that identifies them, unfortunately at the city level, it is very difficult to track.
I have a quick follow-up question, if you don't mind. This is Erica Peterson.
Go ahead.
That if they started FFCRA benefits in 2020 and they have some left in their bank, they are entitled to continue in 2021. I just want to clarify if that's what I heard.
One more time, you cut out the beginning. Are you asking if they have FFCRA related leave in their bank?
And they started in 2020, then are they entitled to continue to 2021 even if the employer has not opted to otherwise generally extend those benefits?
Yeah, I think there's a slightly different issue. If the question is whether you have unused FFCRA or the equivalent of California supplemental paid sick leave entitled to you, but you haven't already used it, can you use in 2021? I think the issue differs depending on whether you're at the federal level or the state level. At the federal level, as you noted, there is no extension of the leave requirement. And so I don't think you would be entitled to use it. The employer can voluntarily allow you to do it and then take the tax credit up through March 31st, but there is no requirement. On the state side of things, there is the ability to continue time into 2021 if it already been commenced being used. So I think that even though the leave it's AB 1867 has expired, there is the ability within the statute to continue using it if you were already using it. And then sort of picking up on the question that we had about the various municipalities, you of course got to look at the municipality in which you're in, because at least several of them have extended their supplemental paid sick leave entitlement into 2021. So even if perhaps there wasn't a federal entitlement to it and you hadn't started using it on the state side, you may still have that ability available to you under a particular municipality level ordinance.
Thank you. That helps clear it up. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, just to make sure we keep on schedule, if there aren't any other questions, I think that's pretty much the end of Michael and my presentation today.
Thank you both, gentlemen. I think that was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure a lot of us will be looking at those resources that you set up. Again, it'll be posted. Audrey will make those slides available to everybody. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out to these gentlemen if you have any questions. We are sort of all in this together. So of course, as members of ACC, feel free to email your colleagues about what we're all doing, because we're all just kind of figuring out as we go too. So anyway, enjoy the rest of your week, everyone. And thank you again to Wilson Turner Kosmo.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.